Good morning. Today we are talking about a topic that most of you should know is near and dear to my heart, periodization. If you've taken me for KINS 4520, you should know that periodization is an incredibly important component to training anyone in any context. Resistance training, soccer, basketball, endurance sports. So today, I'm going to talk about some basic concepts of periodization. For many of you, the first few concepts are a review, and I will probably try to point out some of the subtle nuances or the differences between periodizing training for a resistance trained athlete versus an endurance athlete. For those of you, because I think there's 2 or 3 that have chosen periodization for your literature review, I have to reiterate, you need to make sure you are not discussing periodization from a resistance training context. It has to be from an endurance sports context. All right, so let's jump into it. Again, a lot of this is a review. So let's talk about just the basic definitions, right? You guys should know, right? There's many different definitions out there. I personally like the definition that Buford has put forth with the addition from Isurin's standpoint, right? And that's the planned manipulation of training variables in order to maximize training adaptations and to prevent the onset of overtraining. Okay, so within the context of endurance sports, right, manipulating our training variables, we're talking about our weekly training volume. So for running, miles per week, cycling, miles per week, swimming, yards per week. We're talking about our intensity. How fast are we running? Are we running, and we're going to talk about paces later on, are we running at 8-minute mile pace? Are we running at 10-minute mile pace? Are we running faster, slower, right? We're going to talk about our rest periods, right? So periodization is the manipulation of rest periods. We're going to talk about our frequency, okay? So all of these variables need to be manipulated to maximize training adaptations. We also typically view periodization as breaking the training period, right, the time period down into specific cycles, right? So for some of you guys, you should remember the terms macro cycle, mesocycle, all of that. So we break it down into specific cycles. For athletes, when we're programming them on a seasonal basis, like a college cross-country runner, usually we're thinking about a macro cycle usually, right? 3 months or longer. 3 months is the shortest macro cycle. Usually we think of a macro cycle as like 3 to 6 months, upwards of a year. Usually that would be 2 macro cycles. Then the last thing that I added to this slide today was just programming. Next week we're going to talk even more about programming, but we have to understand the difference between periodization and programming. And periodization is that overarching plan where we have specific focuses that we're trying to develop during certain training cycles. Programming is what we do on a daily level, on a daily basis. It is the micro cycle, okay? So it's the exact numbers that we're going to do on that day, right? You can think of periodization as our goal or our target for that periodized cycle, right? But programming is what we do on a daily level, and that's a key distinction. So you guys should know, right? This is the second time you've seen it in the past year. Leo Medvedev. Leo Medvedev is the father of modern periodization, right? He came out with his book, The Fundamentals of Sports Training, in 1981. His book was aimed at all sports, not just resistance training, team sports as well. But his basic principles were focusing on manipulating and increasing training volume and intensity to maximize the outcome at a specific point, right? And that's the end. That's when we try to peak an athlete. Typically, this is our super crude graphic of what we envision when we think of periodization. right? And this isn't really what it is, but it's a very rough graphic where we start with training volume very high with intensity very low. And as the training cycle progresses, right, we start to decrease our training volume and increase the intensity. Now on the x-axis, it says hypertrophy, strength, power. It's not really much different for an endurance athlete. It's just the terms are different, right? You could substitute them like base training, anaerobic or VO2 max training, and then probably power would be substituted for like speed or something along those lines. We can't talk about periodization without discussing Hans Selye's general adaptation syndrome and supercompensation. Everything we do is a stimulus, right? Everything we do. When we train, we are applying a stimulus with the goal of inducing adaptation to achieve supercompensation, right? So let me try this. I'm going to state that again. When we train, we are trying to apply a stimulus with the goal of trying to induce an adaptation, which in turn will produce supercompensation, right? So if we look at this graphic on the right, we start with a baseline level of fitness. As we go through a training session, and let's say we go and run for 40 minutes, right? Our fitness decreases. In that immediate window, post 40-minute workout, right? We are going to be in worse shape, right? Whether it's glycogen depletion or good muscle damage, we're going to be in worse shape in that immediate post-workout window. Approximately 2 to 3 days later, our body, depending on the severity of the workout, our body will supercompensate and we'll be at a higher level of baseline fitness than when we started. Now, I think you can't see it because my figure is here, but in the bottom right-hand corner, our goal is to apply repeated training bouts, repeated stimuli day after day, and if we string together enough positive adaptations, overall our performance will increase over time. And that's what this picture or graphic in the bottom right-hand corner should show. One of the major components is the division of a specific time period into cycles. Typically, when we're starting at the top, we're talking about a quadrennial. This is rarely programmed. It usually refers to an Olympic cycle every 4 years. More often than not, we're talking about a macro cycle. A macro cycle typically is 6 to 12 months. Sometimes they're as short as 3 months, but typically we're talking about the 6-month range. A mesocycle or mesocycle is usually in the neighborhood of 1 to 6 weeks. So let's say a 3-month macro cycle might be composed of 3 separate mesocycles, right? So let's say we have a 12-week macro cycle. 12 weeks is the approximate length of a high school season. If we're training for 12 weeks, we might train for 4 weeks for general preparedness, 4 weeks as we're building our training volume, and then 4 weeks of peaking, something along those lines. The microcycle typically lasts 1 to 7 days. That's really what you're doing more on a daily basis or even weekly. And then the workout is the individual workout itself. So Medvedev really talked about 2 periods. The general preparatory period, which is early on in a training cycle, where we have this high training volume with a wide variety of exercises that are meant to just develop a general level of conditioning and general ability for sports performance. This would be followed up with a specialized period. As we approach the specialized period, intensity increases, volume typically decreases and our training becomes much more specific to the competition. So an example of this might be if you're training someone for a 5K, let's say, early on, they might spend the majority of their time training in a Jack Daniels quoted, quote unquote, easy zone or even marathon pace. But as you get closer and closer towards their championship race where they're trying to peak, training might become more specific towards something like threshold or even interval pace, right? And they might spend a lot more time training at interval pace. Peaking or peaks. The goal, right, of periodization is to achieve that maximal level of fitness at a specific time period. When would this be? Championship season, right? So if we're talking about high school basketball, if you're trying to make the playoffs, maybe you want to peak right before the playoffs or right for the first round of the playoffs. Conversely, if your team is really, really good, you might know that you don't need to peak the first round of the playoffs. You need to peak maybe like 4 or 5 weeks later for the championship. Now, if we're using an endurance athlete, right, typically it's a lot simpler. It's much more simple for an endurance sport athlete because they don't usually go through seasons unless you're a high school or college. If you're programming for your weekend warrior who runs 5Ks, they get to choose when they're going to race, right? So they're only going to have one peak at the end that they're shooting for a very specific time period, and you could train all the way right up into that peak without looking to develop multiple peaks, right? So traditionally there is just one peak. It is possible to train for 2 or 3 peaks if need be. So this is straight from the NSCA. They define 4 distinct training periods, and I'm just going to tell you guys up front, right? For those of you that might want to use the NSCA textbook for periodization, I don't really like their distinction in training periods. Definitely not for endurance sports. So you have the preparatory period, where your goal is to develop endurance in this case, or basic strength. You've got a transition, which is a deload. Then you have your competition period, right? It's how do you train in season? High intensity, low volume, I already told you that. Second transition would be active rest between championship seasons, and then you would go back again into your preparatory period. I don't really like how this is broken down, and I'm going to give you a different model to build your periodized programs. And I would probably say the other model can be used for triathletes. That's what it's meant for. Cyclists. It could be used for runners, right? So I think that's next. Yeah, so Joe Friel, right, is the author of a book called the Triathlon Training Bible and the Cycling Training Bible. He's a very well-known, very good triathlon and cycling coach. And before I even list his phases, he focuses on developing specific qualities of an athlete, right? So you guys should know what all of these are. There's certain times where you might want to develop VO2 max. There's certain times where you might want to develop and push and improve the lactate thresholds. There's certain times where you might want to improve the aerobic thresholds, muscular endurance and anaerobic endurance. All of these things are different, and they have different intensities that you're training at, different heart rates that you're going to train at. All right. Now, based on when you want to improve these abilities, that's when you're going to spend more time training at lactate threshold, at the aerobic threshold, right? So you don't spend all of your time, but you spend a larger percentage of your training volume at that specific training intensity. Now, here are his phases, right? So these are the Joe Friel phases, training for either a big cycling event or a triathlon. So he's got the preparatory period, where the purpose of the preparatory period is to prepare the body to train. For those of you that have the NSCA textbooks, we would call this the GPP phase, the general physical preparedness phase. And this is approximately 2 to 4 weeks. Next is the base phase. And this is the longest phase for an endurance athlete, where your goal, right, because you're not going to start running right off the bat 50 miles per week, especially if you have never ran before in your life. Your goal is to develop basic abilities, but more importantly for an endurance athlete, it's to emphasize volume, right? So maybe you want to end or peak at 50 miles per week, but you're not going to start there. You're probably going to start them off at, if they're brand new, maybe 15 miles a week. And then over the course of the next 12 weeks, that volume should be incrementally raised, okay? The next phase is the build phase, where now we're developing advanced abilities. So an example of this might be, okay, we've built our base, our engine is now, we've got this big engine, but let's make this engine specific for what we want to accomplish. And this is really where you want to emphasize some of those abilities that were on the prior slide. So maybe you want to focus on the lactate threshold for 4 weeks, and then maybe you want to focus on the VO2 max for the next 4 weeks, something along those lines. So you could develop you could put in 2 mesocycles within this build phase. And then finally, you should go into a peak or a taper, where we haven't talked about it yet, but a peak or a taper is where both volume and intensity drop dramatically. The typical rule of thumb is to decrease both volume and intensity approximately 50% right before a major championship event. So this is the peak. And then finally, you rest, you race, you go through a transition period where you're essentially just trying to get both mentally and physically healthy. This could be anywhere from 1 week to 2 months. I think 2 months is a little on the long end. And then you go through it again for the next training cycle. So I think this is a much better breakdown for an endurance athlete, and this is what your phases should look like. All right, so these last few slides are all about the Jack Daniels text. I don't want to spend a lot of time explaining every single aspect of these. You should read about them in your text. But essentially, Jack Daniels breaks down every training run into 5 different training zones, right? It's easy, marathon, threshold, interval, repetition, right? So 5 different paces, and all of your training runs essentially should be somewhere within these 5 different zones. The most important zone for an endurance athlete is the easy zone, easy runs. And this would apply for anyone from a complete beginner all the way up to an advanced athlete. You are going to spend the vast majority of your training in this easy run zone. So what is this easy run zone? This is approximately 65, that should say 7 to 79% of your heart rate max. Okay, so I think I'll give an example after this. It should also take up approximately 40 to 55% of your weekly mileage, right? So if you're coaching an athlete, and whether they're in the first week of training, second week of training, or the 12th week right before they peak, their easy runs should not be 95% of their training, right? Easy runs should be about 40 to 55%. So let's say we've got a 40-year-old marathoner. We're basically telling them that their easy runs, right, should be trained at approximately 117 to 140 beats per minute. The text offers VO2 max ranges. For the most part, you guys are not going to have VO2 maxes for your athletes, even though they're fictitious, right? So I think training at heart rate is much more realistic and much more practical for you as a coach. So, simply all I did here was the simple 220 minus the age. That leaves with 180 is the hypothetical heart rate max of this athlete. And then I gave you the range, right? 65 to 78% is about 117 to 140 beats per minute. So this athlete should be spending about half of their mileage at this heart rate. For any of you that know anything about heart rate, what you'll realize is this is pretty low. This is really low, right? Some of you guys kind of just get up out of bed and your heart rate's up to 130, right? Easy runs should be just that, very easy. You know, if we're using like a Gunnar-Borg scale, a 12, a 13, something on the Gunnar-Borg scale where it's not that hard, where 20 is the top. And I think, having worked with endurance athletes, this is where people just run way too hard on their easy days, okay? Breaking it down a step further, I think my math was off on this, so ignore that, but it should be about half of their weekly mileage. So if we've got a 40-year-old marathoner that's trying to train, let's say, for 40 miles a week, approximately 20 miles per week should be at this easy pace. The other 20 will be at the other 4 various paces, which we'll discuss next. The purpose of an easy run should be a few things, especially early on in training. It should be to help build injury resilience, right? The next thing is going to be to help train the heart. The heart is going to be the primary, it's not really a limiter, but the primary factor and the primary thing being trained at these easy run paces. When you guys start getting up to higher intensity paces, something like interval pace, we're really pushing some of our bioenergetic systems, like focusing on clearing lactate and hydrogen ions. So it's going to change really the primary focus of what we're trying to develop. So marathon pace. Physiologically, marathon pace is not that much different than easy run pace, where it's still going to probably really focus on the heart, right? From a coaching perspective, right, we're training at a decent clip higher of our maximum heart rate. And then from a programming perspective, the percentage of weekly mileage is much lower, right? You're not going to spend 50% of your time running marathon pace. Instead, you're probably going to spend 15 to 25% of your weekly mileage. So in the same scenario, right, that athlete that's running 40 miles per week or shooting for 40 miles per week, the most they really should be doing at marathon pace is about 10 miles per week, right, using these numbers as rules of thumb. Said, and the goal is to adjust to marathon running pace. There is some speculation that we can upregulate fat metabolism by training at this marathon pace. That's up for debate. My slides are frozen. Okay, threshold pace. So the next pace, and this is just a step higher in terms of intensity, is threshold pace. And the description that Daniels uses is something that's comfortably hard, okay? So it is a hard effort. It's 88 to 97% of your heart rate max. So that 180 beats per minute for that marathoner, we're training at a decent clip of this, right? We're training, you know, upwards of 170, 172 beats per minute, give or take, with the majority of it probably being about 160. Somewhere in that middle range. This should also be no more than 10% of your weekly mileage. So this is important, guys, in terms of programming. When you guys are writing out individual programming, right, 10% of 40 is 4 miles. So there should be no more than 4 miles written for threshold pace in the training program. Okay. Another programming tip, straight from the Daniels text, that you guys should be following. Usually the ideal duration of a straight threshold run is about 20 to 30 minutes. So you'd run for about 20, 25 minutes straight. If somebody's running at 10-minute mile pace, that gets them 2.5 miles. Okay. The other option was cruise intervals. I wouldn't pay too much attention to that, but the benefit, right, of this is an improved lactate threshold. You're really training at your lactate threshold when training at threshold pace. The next thing is interval pace. So interval pace, again, a clip higher. We're training at VO2 max. We're training very at or near your heart rate max. And this, because the intensity is higher, is going to make up a much smaller portion of your weekly mileage. It should be no more than 8% of your weekly mileage. And the ideal duration of the actual repetitions are 3 to 5 minutes. So what's 3 to 5 minutes in terms of running? 3 to 5 minutes is usually something like 1,000 meters, 1,200 meters. It shouldn't be a mile, because your average weekend warrior that has to do, like, if you program in 4 by 1 mile, right? 4 sets of 1 mile repeats for your average weekend warrior is probably going to be somewhere in the neighborhood of 6 minutes, 6:15, 6:30, maybe even 7 minutes. So that 7-minute range falls above the ideal duration. Okay, so we got to make sure that our training distances match up with these ideal lengths. Right? Same thing I just said about the ideal length of threshold pace being 20 to 30 minutes. Now, your last pace programmed is repetition pace. This pace doesn't look at heart rate at all, because it's just too fast, right? You're training at speeds that would get your heart rate up to your heart rate max for sure, but it usually takes time to get to your heart rate max, so you're not looking at your heart rate at all when you're running at these paces. Instead, you're looking at distances. And typically these distances are approximately 2 to 800 meters. Or 2 to 600 meters, excuse me. And it should never be anything longer than 2 minutes, right? So half a lap around the track, boom, you knock that out in like 30, 35, 40 seconds. 1 lap around the track, right? You can knock that out in like 75, 90 seconds, 100 seconds. It should never be any more than 2 minutes. The goal of running at repetition pace is obviously improved speed, because it is fast, and improved running economy. So that was my very quick recap of the 5 different training paces that Jack Daniels provides. There are some graphics in your text that give all of this information. The only thing that I adjusted is the total percentage from your easy pace, right? Where I think it said 25 to 30, and in my opinion, that's a mistake, I even think it's a typo, because if you look at the total percentages, they don't add up to 100%, right? So I upped it to 40 to 55% of weekly mileage should come from your easy pace. Everything else that it's in these slides comes straight from that text. So if you have any questions, or if you're writing programming, refer back to your textbook for guidelines on how many repetitions, the total time, the total pace, so on and so forth. Now, today, especially talking about these paces might have sounded a little confusing, but you guys will have an assignment, not due next week. It'll be probably due in 2 weeks, I think, but don't worry about it, where you're going to have to write a little programming out based on Jack Daniels' formulas, right? So next week, I'm going to explain all of VDOT, and that's going to be your only assignment. Read the chapter, the Jack Daniels chapter on VDOT. I think it is chapter, looking at it now, give me a second, 5. Read chapter 5. You're going to have to learn how to program with VDOT, what VDOT is, all of that good stuff. So make sure you read chapter 5. That's what I'm going to spend a solid 20, 30, 40 minutes explaining next week.